Hello and welcome to more history stuff. And in this episode, once again, I'm talking about the medieval history of Wales. Uh, in this case, the late 13th century, the period of the Edwardian conquest of Wales. Very controversial subject, still stirs up a lot of passions and emotions for obvious reasons. Uh, and I wanted to talk about something in particular, a very recent development, which is the erection of a plaque, a public memorial on a golf course close to Bulth Wells on the alleged site of where the Prince of Wales in the 13th century, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, and his army were attacked and defeated by the English, or rather the Marcher Lords, who were the lords of the borderlands that effectively operated as a buffer zone between England and Wales in the medieval period. Now, this is a very thorny subject indeed, and I know from quite unpleasant experience on social media that to even broach it can be a bit dodgy. It's a bit like putting your foot in a bowl of steaming hot water. I mean, you will get burnt. And this is because the circumstances of Llywelyn's death are quite murky. Apart from being an emotional subject in itself, because his death heralded the end of the long-running attempt by the Lords of Gwynedd in North Wales to unite Wales into a single principality that might, in time, if this project had succeeded, had led to Wales becoming an independent nation, politically separate from England. That might have happened. His death and Edward I's victory in 1283 really put an end to any such prospect. And so, as I said, it still gets people quite sort of angry and hot under the collar these days, 700 years later. And the circumstances of Llywelyn's death are quite murky. There's something like 40 separate chronicle and poetry sources, Welsh and English, that describe what happened to him, but only one eyewitness account, and that is by a chap called Roger Lestrange, who was captain of the King's army in the Middle Marches in the region of Bulth Wells. And very shortly after Llywelyn was killed, possibly within hours or immediately afterwards, Lestrange scribbled this quite brief note to the king, telling him the facts. It's a very pithy, matter-of-fact report, because Lestrange knew his master and he knew full well that Edward would just want the facts. You know, don't embroider or waffle as I'm doing. And Lestrange, to quote from his letter, he said, "No, sire," I'm paraphrasing a bit, that Llywelyn is dead and all the flower of his army with him. The flower of his army could be taken to mean that perhaps Llywelyn and only his bodyguard, the core of his army, the taili, mounted bodyguard, the taili is the Welsh term, were killed, and perhaps the rest of the army got away or was scattered. We don't really know, because Lestrange doesn't tell us, and certainly from the king's perspective it doesn't really matter. The main thing is that Llywelyn is dead, and that ripped the heart out of Welsh resistance. So this plaque, an image of which you can see at the start of this video, that was literally put up yesterday by a society, quite a mysterious society called the Cofio Llywelyn Society, Remember Llywelyn, which, as far as I can tell, seems to have appointed itself. The members seem to have decided, we're going to set up a committee and we decide what should be put on a public monument in Wales, and basically we control the narrative. I don't know quite where they got that authority from, but it's just, they just went ahead and did it. So, okay, fine. I mean, anyone can do that, I suppose. I could go and nail up a plaque outside my front door, but you know, most people don't really sort of behave like that. Anyway, and the content of this plaque, the text that's on it, is quite problematic. because it states that it is being put up to commemorate the death of Llywelyn and 3,000 of his soldiers on this spot, which is now a golf club, I believe, in the 10th or the 11th of December 1282. Now, I should say to begin with that I have no problem with the idea of commemorating Llywelyn, because it was obviously a very important and traumatic event in Welsh history, arguably one of the most important moments in the history of Wales. So there's nothing wrong with commemorating it. The problem is in the detail of the text that's been put on this plaque and the location and the context. You know, these are three quite major problems. With regards to the location, there is no proof whatsoever that Llywelyn and his men were killed on this particular spot. That impression stems from a quite strange booklet that came out in the 1980s called The Ghosts on the Fairway, the Army That Vanished. And this was written by a chap called Anthony Edwards, a retired pharmacist, who, to his credit, despite trying to work in a pre-internet age and with very limited access to the original sources, he did try to reopen this debate on the fate of Llywelyn, which had arguably been passed over a little bit previously. In his booklet, Edwards threw out this idea that Llywelyn's men were ambushed by the March Lords on this particular spot, which is now, as I say, a golf course, and they were wiped out in a sort of treacherous ambush. And he got this impression from a particular source, which is the Chronicle of Peterborough Abbey, an English monastic chronicle. And I've got the actual text of this source in front of me, this particular chronicle account. It's quite long, so I'll just read out the relevant bit, which has actually influenced the content on the plaque. So this is a translation from the Latin, and it reads, "In a prearranged place they met with Llywelyn and his confederates about the hour of vespers, and they despoiled him and all his army. Thus he was slain in the same place, and his head was cut off and brought to the king at Rhuddlan. And from there it was sent to London, where it was placed on top of the tower. Furthermore, not one of the prince's cavalry escaped death, but they were killed with 3,000 of the foot, and also the 3 magnates of his land who died with him, namely Almarvan, who was lord of Llanbaran Fawr, Rhys ap Gruffudd, who was seneschal of all the land of the prince, and thirdly, it is thought, Llywelyn Vychan, who was lord of Bromfield. Of the English, truly it is said, none in that place were killed or wounded." So that's the chronicle account. Now, you can pick all kinds of bones out of this. This is one account of a wide range of chronicle accounts of Llywelyn's death, most of which differ slightly in the details, which implies, of course, that the chroniclers didn't really know what had happened. None of them were eyewitnesses. They were getting their information second or third hand. And certainly by any modern standard of historiography and reportage, you simply cannot lean on one account at the expense of the others. And I'll give you a couple of examples why. The Peterborough chronicler says that not one of the prince's cavalry escaped death, but they were killed with 3,000 of the foot, 3,000 of the infantry. In the earlier part of the account, he gave precise figures for the size of Llywelyn's army. He said he had 160 cavalry, these are taili, the mounted bodyguard, and 7,000 foot soldiers. Now, where the chronicler, an English chronicler, got that information, we have no idea. There is nothing to support the impression that this was the precise size of Llywelyn's army, because we don't have, unfortunately, the kind of administrative accounts that we have for the English armies at this period. In England, from the reign of King John onwards, the government really starts to churn out a lot of administrative documents, wage rolls, supply, victuals, that sort of thing. So and a lot of this material survives. Pardon, frog in my throat. So we are fortunate enough to know pretty well the size and the capability of the English military machine in this period. Nothing of the sort survives for the Principality of Wales that was ruled over by Llywelyn and his dynasty. So we have no means of knowing where this chronicler has got his information from. I mean, he might have been completely accurate. Maybe he got it from an eyewitness, but he didn't say as much, and we have no way of knowing that. So it cannot be quoted, ideally, on a public monument as fact, as gospel, because it isn't. It simply isn't. Either something is or it isn't, and this is not. So, wherever you stand on this subject, whether you are a Welsh nationalist, or you're slightly ambivalent, or you don't really care at all, either way, there's that saying, facts don't care about your feelings, and they really don't. So that's a problem. It's even more of a problem when you compare the Peterborough account to another English chronicle, the Annals of Dunstable, which says that killed with the prince were 3 of his magnates and up to 2,000 of his infantry, though truly only a few of his cavalry. So this Dunstable account flatly contradicts the Peterborough Chronicle. It gives entirely different figures for the casualties. It says that up to 2,000 of Llywelyn's infantry, as opposed to 3,000, were killed, and only a few of his cavalry, whereas the Peterborough chronicler had said that all of the cavalry were killed. So again, you can see the problem. I mean, why should we believe the Peterborough Chronicle? Why would you invest all of your trust in that, whilst completely disregarding another English source, which says something completely different? The only facts they agree upon are that Llywelyn himself was killed, along with 3 of his lords, 3 of his magnates. And these are quite interesting characters in themselves. I mean, one of them, Rhysap Gruffudd, he had actually previously, in the previous war, he had fought for Edward I against Llywelyn, and his brother Hywel was still serving the king in 1283, and he actually died at the Battle of Moel Don on the Menai Strait, fighting for Edward. Llywelyn Vychan, the 3rd man who is said to have been killed, the Lord of Bromfield, nicknamed the Dragon of Chirk, he had also fought for Edward in the previous war, only to defect back to Llywelyn just in time to be killed alongside him. So these accounts are, if nothing else, interesting examples of the kind of fractured loyalties and shifting allegiances in Wales at this time. All of which is far too long-winded to put on a plaque. And that's another problem with public monuments. They reduce everything to sound bites. Everything is stripped of context and extraneous detail, and you just get these flat statements, which, to my mind, are slightly... they're not only misleading, but they're manipulative. They're intended to make people, the general public, think a certain way and enforce a certain perspective, which is essentially political. It's weaponized history. It's another good term, which I'm uncomfortable with. I don't like it because it's manipulative, and this idea that it's projecting some kind of truth. This is the truth that the man, in this case the wicked English state, didn't want you to know. Well, for a start, nobody has ever attempted to hide these English chronicle accounts. They're in plain sight, and everyone who's interested can gain access to them, and has been able to do so for the past 700 years, if you really want to read them. They've never been locked away in a chamber under the Tower of London somewhere. And secondly, for all the reasons I've described, they cannot be relied on. These English chroniclers were not so much attempting to hide or gloss over the truth as give their version of it. In the Peterborough case, in a very boastful way, the chronicler, whoever he was, we've no idea who this monk was, we don't know his name, was boasting about the defeat of Llywelyn and the destruction of the Welsh army. So when he says at the end, truly it is said none of the English were killed or wounded, well, that's been taken to mean that, well, that must mean that it was an ambush, and that Llywelyn's army was surrounded and tricked. And again, according to that chap, Anthony Edwards, back in the 1980s, they were all fooled into laying down their weapons, at which point the marchers set upon them and slaughtered the lot. Well, if that's true, then why weren't they all killed? If 3,000 of the infantry and all the cavalry were escaped, well, the Peterborough account says that there were 7,000 infantry present. If this was a calculated, coordinated massacre, it's a remarkably incompetent one, because 4,000 men apparently got away somehow. And if there's one thing we can't accuse the Lords of the March of being in this period, it's incompetent killers. They're very good at this sort of thing. They're violent, predatory men. And if they set up an ambush and they wanted you dead, you ended up dead. They didn't mess about, and they certainly wouldn't have let over half of Llywelyn's army just slip out of the trap and run into the hills. So, in summary, this is very unfortunate because it's completely unreliable. The text on this plaque, which has been trumpeted everywhere, all over social media, everyone's getting very excited about it. This is the truth about the fate of Llywelyn and his army. It's nonsense. It's based on very dubious medieval sources, can't be relied upon, manipulative, dishonest, intellectually and emotionally dishonest, and a little bit depressing. So I mean, I appreciate that sounds very harsh, and I've expressed a very strong opinion, but I happen to have a strong opinion on this subject, and it's not, I hope, an uninformed one. And I mean, we all have our preferences and our prejudices, there's no point pretending otherwise, but I hope that I am not expressing a prejudice when I say any of this, that I'm just, I'm trying to take the subject seriously, I think. And it seems to me that this recent trend in terms of what's happening in Wales with public monuments to these ancient events, it's not really taking the subject seriously, it's pretending to, but really it is politicised and manipulative and really thoroughly unpleasant. And you may disagree with me, and as I've said in previous videos, that's absolutely fine, but that is my opinion and I'm going to express it. So if you don't like it, too bad. Okay, well, I hope you found that interesting and enjoyable, possibly. Thank you. Goodbye.